We look at our phones to check the weather. We buy food wrapped in plastic from a store 1,000 miles away. We throw away a shirt with a small hole. It all seems normal, but is it? For nearly all of human history, life was completely different. We think of the medieval period, that thousand-year stretch from about 500 to 1500 AD, as dark and dirty. A time of plagues and ignorance. And in many ways it was. But they also knew things we've forgotten. They knew how to survive. They knew how to make things last. They had a kind of practical wisdom that came from necessity. What if some of that lost knowledge could actually make our modern lives simpler? Not by going back to the mud and toil, but by borrowing the best of their ideas. What if the solution to our cluttered, complicated world isn't a new app, but a very old way of thinking? Could a medieval peasant's approach to food, clothing, and community actually hold the key to a better, more grounded life today? Number 21. Could you find your way home without a map? We are lost without our phones. GPS tells us where to turn, where to walk, where we are. It's a tiny miracle in our pocket, but it has a cost. We don't look up anymore. We don't notice the shape of the hills, the way a certain tree marks a turn, or which way the sun is setting. We've outsourced our sense of direction. A medieval traveler had nothing but their own senses. They had to navigate vast, unmarked territories using the world around them. Their primary tool was the sun. It rises in the east and sets in the west. At noon in the northern hemisphere, it's in the southern part of the sky. This simple, reliable fact was the foundation of all daytime navigation. It wasn't about pinpoint accuracy, it was about general direction. Am I heading north? Am I going toward the setting sun? That was often enough. At night they had the stars. The North Star, or Polaris, was the anchor of the night sky. It barely moves, sitting directly over the North Pole. Find it, and you know which way is north. Sailors relied on it for centuries. The Vikings, masters of the open sea, were navigating by the sun and stars back in the 9th century. They developed tools like the sun compass, a simple device that used a shadow cast by a central pin to determine direction, even on a cloudy day by detecting polarized light with a sunstone. But it wasn't just about the sky. They read the land itself. A river probably flows downhill towards a larger body of water, maybe the sea or a lake where a town is situated. They knew that certain types of moss tend to grow on the shadier, north-facing side of trees in the northern hemisphere. They followed ridges and valleys. They looked for landmarks that were part of local lore. That strange-shaped rock, that ancient oak tree, the ruins of an old fort. These were the signposts. Stories and songs often contained embedded directions, mnemonic devices passed down through generations. The Roman road network, though centuries old by the medieval period, still formed the skeleton of travel in many parts of Europe. Even when a road was just a dirt track, following its path was a reliable way to get from one major settlement to another. A book from the 13th century, the Tabula Peutingeriana, is a fascinating example. It's not a geographically accurate map in our sense. It's a schematic, a diagram of roads showing towns and the distances between them, like a modern subway map. It was practical, not precise. So what's the use for us? It's about re-engaging our brains. It's about developing situational awareness. Try this next time you go for a walk in a familiar area. Put your phone away. Try to navigate by landmarks. Notice the direction of the sun. At night, find the Big Dipper and use its two outer stars to point to the North Star. It's a skill, and like any skill, it gets stronger with practice. It forces you to be present, to observe your surroundings instead of staring at a screen. Research from McGill University in 2017 showed that people who use spatial navigation strategies, learning the world around them, have more gray matter in their hippocampus than people who primarily rely on GPS following directions. That part of the brain is crucial for memory and is one of the first areas to decline in Alzheimer's disease. Learning to read the world isn't just a quaint survival skill, it might actually be good for your brain. It reconnects you to the physical world in a profound way. You start to build a mental map, a deep, intuitive sense of place that no app can replicate. We think we have mapped the entire world, but what have we lost in the process? How much of medieval navigation was based on senses we no longer value, like smell or the feel of the wind? Were there subtle environmental cues known to every peasant that modern science has never even thought to look for? When a medieval person got truly lost, did they have mental or spiritual techniques for finding their way that are completely alien to us now? Number 20. Can you really get clean with ash and fat? We walked down aisles filled with brightly colored bottles, shampoos, conditioners, body washes, face scrubs. Each one promises a different miracle, with a list of ingredients a mile long. The modern idea of clean is complex and chemical. The medieval idea was much, much simpler. It was based on two things, fat and ash, that's it. That's how you make lye soap. The process was a common household chore, not a boutique craft. You'd take hardwood ashes from your fireplace or cooking fire and put them in a barrel with a small hole at the bottom. And then you'd pour water over them. The water would trickle through, leaching out potassium hydroxide, a powerful alkali. This brownish liquid was lye. It was caustic and dangerous, but they knew how to handle it. You tested its strength by seeing if an egg or a potato would float in it. Next, you needed fat. This was usually tallow rendered from beef or mutton fat, or lard from pigs. Every part of the animal was used, and this was a key use for the leftover fat. You'd heat the fat in a large pot and slowly, carefully pour in the lye. You had to stir it constantly for hours. It was a long, slow process. The mixture would gradually thicken in a process called saponification, where the alkali breaks down the fats into fatty acids, salts, soap, and glycerol. Finally, you'd pour the thick liquid into a wooden mold, let it cool and harden for a few days, and then cut it into rough bars. The soap needed to cure for several weeks to let the chemical reaction complete, and for the excess lye to be neutralized. A fresh bar of soap would be harsh on the skin. This wasn't luxury soap, it was a powerful all-purpose cleaner. It was used for laundry, for scrubbing floors, and yes, for washing people. Was it pleasant? Probably not by our standards. It wouldn't have smelled of lavender or sandalwood. It would have smelled like fat. But it worked. It cut through grease and dirt effectively. The archaeological finds confirm soap making in the medieval world. For instance, the chemists and doctors of the Islamic Golden Age, like Al-Razi in the 9th century, wrote down detailed recipes for soap, sometimes even perfuming it with oils. In Europe, professional soap makers' guilds emerged in cities like Marseille and Venice by the 12th and 13th centuries, creating higher quality soaps using olive oil Castile soap instead of animal fat. But for the average person, soap was a homemade functional product. Why should we care about this smelly brown soap? Because it represents a fundamental shift in our thinking. It's about using waste products, ash, animal fat to create something useful. It's about understanding a simple chemical reaction. You can make soap at home today, and many people do. You can buy Ly sodium hydroxide safely and use plant-based oils like coconut or olive oil. You understand exactly what's in it. No unpronounceable chemicals, no plastic bottle to throw away. It's a small act of self-sufficiency. It also makes you appreciate what clean really means. Do we need a dozen different products, or do we just need one thing that works? This medieval hack simplifies our cleaning cabinets and reconnects us to the basic chemistry of our world. It's a reminder that the most essential things are often made from the simplest ingredients. We know they made soap, but how common was its use on the body versus for laundry? Did the harshness of homemade lye soap contribute to the skin diseases that were so common in the medieval period? Were there regional variations in soap making, using local plants or fats, that created soaps with properties we can no longer replicate? What forgotten cleaning agents, perhaps derived from specific plants, did they use before soap became widespread? Number 19. What if your garbage fed you? Our system is simple. We create trash. We put it in a bin. A truck takes it away to a landfill. A giant stinking mountain of waste hidden somewhere out of sight. Out of sight, out of mind. In 2018, the United States alone generated 292.4 million tons of municipal solid waste. That's about 5 pounds per person per day. A medieval household produced almost no waste in the modern sense. Everything had a use. And this wasn't because they were proto-environmentalists. It was born of pure necessity. Throwing something away was throwing away a resource you might need to survive the winter. The concept of a circular economy was their reality. Let's look at a typical peasant family. They cook a meal. The vegetable scraps, peels, ends, cores don't go in a bin. They go into a slop bucket for the pig. The pig was the ultimate recycler, turning inedible human food into valuable pork. Any scraps the pig couldn't eat, along with animal bedding, human waste from the chamber pot, and old thatch from the roof, went onto the midden heap. This was a carefully managed compost pile, usually located a short distance from the house. It wasn't just a pile of garbage, it was the future of their farm. Over time, this organic matter would decompose, turning into a rich, dark fertilizer. In the spring, this night soil would be spread on the vegetable garden and fields, returning nutrients to the soil to grow the next year's crops. This is the very definition of a closed-loop system. The waste from one process is the fuel for the next. The book Life in a Medieval Village by Francis and Joseph Geese details this intimate connection between the household, its waste, and its food production. It went beyond food scraps. A broken wooden tool, the wood would be burned for fuel. A worn-out piece of clothing, it would be patched, then turned into rags, then maybe used to make paper or left to rot on the midden heap. And bones from a slaughtered animal would be boiled for broth until every bit of nutrition was extracted. Then they could be carved into tools like needles or buttons or ground into bone meal to fertilize the garden. Nothing was disposable. Even something as simple as ash from the fire was a valuable resource, used to make soap or to improve the pH of acidic soil. This mindset is so alien to us. We live in a world of single-use plastics and planned obsolescence, where things are designed to be thrown away. How can we apply this? The most direct way is composting. A huge percentage of our household waste is organic matter. Composting it at home or through a municipal program keeps it out of landfills where it produces methane, a potent greenhouse gas. It also gives you free, nutrient-rich fertilizer for your garden or houseplants. It's a small, tangible way to break out of the linear take, make, waste model. But the deeper lesson is in the mindset. It's about seeing waste as a resource. Before you throw something away, ask the medieval question, what else could this be? Can this glass jar be used for storage? Can this old t-shirt become a cleaning rag? Can these vegetable scraps become soup stock? It's not about living in squalor. It's about being clever, resourceful, and respectful of the materials that pass through our lives. It simplifies things because you buy less, you throw away less, and you become a producer, not just a consumer. We understand the basics of their composting, but did they have sophisticated techniques for managing different types of waste to create specific soil amendments? Were there master composters in a village whose knowledge was highly prized? Could the pathogens in their night soil, which we see as a huge health risk, have actually conferred some kind of microbial immunity to the population that we have now lost? How much valuable nutrient-rich topsoil did they create over centuries that has since been destroyed by modern industrial agriculture? Number 18 is a boring routine, the key to freedom. We crave novelty, we chase new experiences, new shows to binge watch, new updates on our social media feeds. Our lives are a frantic search for stimulation, but this constant churn can be exhausting. There is a deep wisdom in the medieval world that runs completely counter to this, the power of a predictable cyclical routine. For most people, and especially for those in monastic life, the day was not a blank slate to be filled. It was a preordained structure guided by the sun and the church bells. The best example is the Rule of St. Benedict. Written around the year 530, this book wasn't just a religious text, it was a comprehensive guide to managing a community and a life. It laid out a daily schedule for monks that was followed for centuries across thousands of monasteries. The day was divided into the 8 canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Each hour was a time for prayer, but the schedule also structured the entire day. Between these services, there were set times for work, ora et labora, or pray and work, for reading, for eating, and for sleeping. For example, the time between prime around 6 a.m. and terce around 9 a.m. was typically for labor in the fields or workshops. The time after the midday meal might be for reading and study. This wasn't just about religious devotion. It was a profoundly practical system for organizing time and energy. By making the daily structure automatic, it freed the mind from the constant burden of decision-making. You didn't have to wonder what you should do next. The schedule told you. This is what modern psychologists call reducing decision fatigue. Our brains have a finite amount of energy for making choices each day. By automating the small recurring decisions, we save our mental resources for more important tasks. The monastic schedule created a rhythm, a predictable flow that was both calming and productive. The life of a peasant was similarly structured, but by the seasons instead of the bells. The agricultural year dictated everything. There was a time for plowing, a time for sowing, a time for weeding, and a time for harvesting. Winter was a time for mending tools, spinning wool, and surviving. This seasonal rhythm provided a deep grounding connection to the natural world. How can we use this? We don't need to become monks, but we can build a simple, stable routine. A personal rule of life. This means setting consistent times for waking up and going to sleep. It means having a simple morning ritual, like maybe it's stretching, or reading a few pages of a book, or just sitting with a cup of coffee without your phone. It means blocking out time for deep work, for exercise, for chores, for rest. By creating a predictable framework, you stop wasting energy on the what and when, and can focus on the how. Author Cal Newport, in his book Deep Work, argues that routines and rituals are essential for producing high-quality work because they signal to your brain that it's time to focus. A medieval monk knew, without question, that when the bell for sex rang, it was time for prayer. When the bell for work rang, it was time for work. This clarity is a powerful antidote to the scattered, reactive way many of us live our lives. We see the structure of the Rule of Benedict, but how much was it actually followed? Was there a hidden world of rebellion and improvisation within the strict monastic day? How did the peasants' seasonal rhythm affect their mental health? Was the dark, idle winter a time of deep depression or a necessary and welcome rest? Did the lack of personal choice in their daily schedule lead to a kind of contentment that is impossible for us to achieve in our world of infinite options? Number 17. What if your walls could breathe? We live in sealed boxes, our homes are wrapped in plastic sheeting, packed with fiberglass insulation, and sealed tight with caulk. The goal is thermal efficiency. We want to trap the air we've paid to heat or cool inside. But this creates its own problems: poor indoor air quality, trapped moisture, and the potential for mold. A medieval house was the exact opposite. It was designed to breathe. The most common building method for a peasant home was called wattle and daub. It sounds primitive, but it was a clever and sustainable technology. First, you'd have a timber frame, usually made from local oak. Then, between the timbers, you'd weave a lattice of thin, flexible branches like hazel or willow. This was the wattle. It looked like a giant, rough basket. Then you'd mix up the daub. This was a sticky mixture of clay, sand, straw, and animal dung. You'd slap this mixture onto the wattle, pushing it into all the gaps from both the inside and the outside. Once it dried, you'd have a surprisingly strong and well-insulated wall. It was then often coated with lime wash, a mixture of lime and water, which acted as a protective and mildly antiseptic paint. The genius of this system was its breathability. Unlike our modern walls with their plastic vapor barriers, a wattle and daub wall is vapor permeable. This means moisture can pass through it. When you breathe, cook, or wash inside, you release water vapor into the air. In a modern home, this moisture can get trapped in the wall cavities and lead to mold and rot. In a wattle and daub house, the moisture is absorbed by the clay and straw and then slowly released to the outside as the air conditions change. The walls are constantly, passively managing the humidity levels inside the home, creating a healthier living environment. The book The Old Way of Seeing by Jonathan Hale discusses how these older building materials worked in harmony with their environment rather than fighting against it. They were what we would now call hygroscopic. They buffer moisture. This approach is seeing a revival in the natural building movement. People are building homes with straw bales, Kabbalah like daub, but without the wattle and rammed earth. These materials are not only sustainable and locally sourced, but they also create walls that breathe. The benefits are better indoor air quality and more stable humidity levels, often without the need for complex and expensive HVAC systems. We can't all build a wattle and daub house, but we can apply the principle. We can choose natural, breathable materials when we renovate. Things like lime plaster instead of gypsum drywall, or wood fiber insulation instead of foam. We can also simply remember to open our windows. For centuries, this was the primary way to ventilate a home. It flushes out stale air, reduces pollutants, and reconnects us with the outside world. The medieval builder understood something fundamental. A house shouldn't be a sealed container. It should be more like a third skin, protecting you from the elements while still allowing for a healthy exchange with the world around it. We know the general recipe for daub, but did different regions have secret ingredients, specific types of clay or additives from local plants that gave their walls superior properties? How did they manage pest control in walls made of straw and wood without modern chemicals? Like, could the constant low-level exposure to the microbes in the clay and like dung of the walls have actually strengthened their immune systems in ways we don't understand? Was the acoustic quality of these soft, uneven walls so different from our hard, flat drywall that it changed the way they experience sound and speech? Number 16, could you light up your night with a weed and some fat? When it gets dark, we flip a switch. Light, instant and brilliant, floods the room. We take it for granted, but for most of human history, the coming of night was a profound event. It meant the end of the working day and a retreat into a world of firelight and shadow. Creating light was a difficult, resource-intensive task, and for the average medieval person, the most common form of artificial light wasn't a candle. It was a rushlight. A rushlight is incredibly simple. You take a common rush, a plant that grows in marshy areas. So you peel away the outer green skin, leaving a single, thin strip to act as a spine for the soft, spongy pith inside. And then you let it dry completely. Once dry, you take the long, fragile pith and dip it into a container of melted fat. This would be whatever fat was available in cheap bacon grease, mutton drippings, any kind of kitchen waste fat. You'd draw the soaked pith through your fingers to remove the excess, and then let it cool and harden. What you were left with was a long, thin, stiff stick of fat-soaked pith. That was your rushlight. You'd typically mount it in a simple holder, often a piece of wood with a metal clip, angled at about 45 degrees. When you lit the end, it would burn slowly, giving off a small, smoky, smelly flame. It wasn't great light. The 18th century naturalist Gilbert White, in his book The Natural History and Antiquities of Selborne, calculated that a single rushlight, about 28 inches long, would burn for nearly an hour. You know, it gave off just enough light to see by, perhaps for mending clothes or telling stories around the fire. It was the cheapest light source imaginable, made from a foraged plant and a waste product. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were a step up. They gave a better light but were more expensive to make and tended to sputter and smoke. The real luxury was the beeswax candle. These were used almost exclusively by the church and the very wealthy. They burned clean and bright, with a pleasant smell. A medieval peasant might see dozens of them lighting up a cathedral, a vision of heavenly light that was a stark contrast to their dim, smoky homes. The lesson here isn't that we should go back to smelly rushlights. It's about appreciating light and rethinking our relationship with darkness. Our world is saturated with artificial light 24/7. This light pollution disrupts the rhythms of nocturnal animals, and it disrupts our own biology. Exposure to bright, blue spectrum light at night from screens and LED bulbs can suppress the production of melatonin, the hormone that regulates sleep. A 2011 study from Harvard, researchers found that exposure to room light before bedtime shortened melatonin duration by about 90 minutes. The medieval world lived by the sun. When it set, activity wound down. The evening was a time for quiet, indoor tasks by a dim light. This forced rhythm of light and dark is something our bodies are still wired for. We can reintroduce this rhythm. We can use dim, warm-colored lights in the evening. We can use candles safely, of course, to create a calmer atmosphere. We can implement a digital sunset, turning off all screens an hour or two before bed. It's about reclaiming the darkness. It's not something to be eliminated, but a natural and necessary part of the day that signals to our bodies that it's time to rest and repair. The humble rushlight is a reminder that for most of history, light was precious and darkness was normal. Maybe we need a little more of that normal darkness in our lives. What other plants besides rushes were used to make wicks, and did they have different burning properties? Did the type of animal fat used to soak the rushlight dramatically change the quality of the light or the amount of smoke and smell? Were there tricks now lost to make rushlights burn longer or brighter? Beyond just telling time, did the slow, predictable burning of a rushlight serve as a kind of timer for evening prayers or chores? Number 15, could the secret to a happy gut be 1,000 years old? We walk through health food stores and see aisles of kombucha, kefir, kimchi, and probiotic supplements. We're obsessed with our gut microbiome, this complex ecosystem of bacteria inside us. We're rediscovering a very old truth: fermented foods are good for us. But for a medieval person, fermentation wasn't a health trend. It was a matter of survival. Before refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Fermentation was one of the primary methods of preservation. It's a process where microorganisms like bacteria and yeast convert sugars into other compounds like alcohol or organic acids. These compounds act as natural preservatives, preventing the growth of harmful, rot-causing microbes. The medieval diet was packed with fermented foods and drinks, not by choice, but by necessity. And water from rivers and wells was often contaminated and unsafe to drink, but beer and ale were safe. The process of boiling the water to make the wort and the presence of alcohol in the final product killed off most pathogens. For many people, especially in towns and cities, small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew, was the staple daily drink for everyone, including children. It was hydrating and nutritious, a source of calories and B vitamins. Bread was another staple. And until the last few centuries, all leavened bread was sourdough. They didn't have commercial yeast packets. Bakers would maintain a starter, a living culture of wild yeasts and lactobacilli captured from the air and the flour itself. This starter would be used to raise the bread. The long fermentation process of sourdough doesn't just create a delicious, tangy flavor. It also breaks down some of the gluten and anti-nutrients in the flour, making the bread easier to digest and its nutrients more available to the body. Milk was turned into cheese and yogurt. Cabbage was turned into sauerkraut. The meats were cured and fermented to make sausages like salami. These weren't delicacies. They were the practical ways to make the harvest of the summer last through the lean months of winter. The science behind this was a complete mystery to them. The role of microorganisms was only discovered by Louis Pasteur in the 19th century. For the medieval brewer or baker, it was a kind of magic, a gift from God. They knew that if you left grape juice out, it became wine. They knew that if you added a piece of old dough to new dough, it would rise. It was a craft based on tradition and observation, passed down through generations. And in the process of preserving their food, they were constantly feeding their bodies a rich and diverse array of live microorganisms. Modern science is just beginning to understand the profound impact this has on our immune systems, our digestion, and even our mental health. A 2021 study from the Stanford School of Medicine found that a diet high in fermented foods increased microbiome diversity and decreased markers of inflammation. This is one of the easiest medieval hacks to incorporate into our lives. You can learn to bake sourdough bread. You can make your own yogurt or sauerkraut at home with nothing more than a jar, salt, and some patience. You can choose to buy high-quality, naturally fermented foods. It reconnects you to your food, turning you from a passive consumer into an active participant in its creation. It's a slow, ancient process that feels deeply satisfying in a fast-paced world. And it might just make your gut a lot happier. How many unique strains of wild yeast and bacteria specific to certain villages or bakeries have been lost forever due to the rise of commercial monoculture yeast? Did some of the magical or superstitious rituals surrounding brewing and baking actually serve a practical microbial purpose we don't understand? Could some historical plagues or widespread illnesses have been caused by batches of fermentation gone wrong, producing toxins that our records attribute to other causes? Was the taste of home for a medieval person largely determined by the specific microbiome of their household's ferments? Number 14, can a story be more powerful than a book? We are drowning in information. We have access to more text, more data, more images than any human beings in history. We learn by reading, by watching videos, by scrolling through feeds. But for most of the medieval period, the vast majority of people were illiterate. Books were rare, precious objects, painstakingly copied by hand. So how did knowledge get passed on? How did people learn, remember, and share complex information? They used the most powerful technology ever invented, the human voice, connected to the human memory. This was the age of oral tradition. History wasn't just something you read in a book. It was something you heard, in the form of an epic poem or a song recited by a bard in the great hall of a lord. Your legal precedents were not always written down. They were held in the memory of the elders of the community. News traveled not by newspaper, but by word of mouth, passed from traveler to pilgrim to merchant. Stories, proverbs, and folktales were the primary way that cultural values, moral lessons, and practical wisdom were transmitted from one generation to the next. These weren't just simple bedtime stories, they were complex data storage systems encoded with information about geography, genealogy, and social norms. The work of scholars like Milman Parry and Albert Lord In the 20th century, studying epic singers in the Balkans showed how these oral traditions worked. The bards didn't memorize a poem word for word. They learned a complex system of formulas, themes, and narrative patterns, and would essentially recompose the story in the moment of performance. It was a living, breathing form of knowledge. For the literate elite, memory was still a crucial skill. Before the printing press made books common, a scholar's library was largely in their head. They developed sophisticated techniques to help them remember vast amounts of information. One of the most famous was the memory palace, or the method of Loki. This technique, which dates back to ancient Greece but was widely used in the medieval period, involves visualizing a familiar building, like a monastery or a cathedral. You then mentally place the things you want to remember at specific locations within that building. To recall the information, you simply take a mental walk through your palace and see the items you placed there. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus were masters of this technique, capable of holding entire libraries of theological and philosophical arguments in their minds. The book, The Art of Memory by Francis C. Yates, is a classic exploration of this fascinating history. What can we take from this? Our memories have grown weak. We've outsourced them to our devices. We don't remember phone numbers. They're in our contacts. We don't remember directions. They're on the map. We don't even need to remember facts. We can just Google them. We can strengthen our memories by practicing these old techniques. Try building a simple memory palace for your grocery list. Instead of writing it down, visualize your house and place the milk on the doorstep, the bread on the couch, the eggs on the TV. It sounds silly, but it works. More importantly, we can revive the art of oral storytelling. Tell your kids stories instead of just reading to them. Share family histories. Learn a poem or a short story by heart and recite it for friends. This does more than just train your memory. It builds connection. It forces you to be present with other people in a way that consuming digital media does not. It reminds us that knowledge isn't just cold data. It's a living thing that is meant to be shared between people. How much historical information, particularly the history of ordinary people, was lost forever when these oral traditions died out. Were the memory palaces of medieval scholars so complex and vivid that they were more like a form of virtual reality than a simple mnemonic? Did the rhythm and meter of poems and songs have a neurological effect that made information easier to memorize, a kind of ancient brain hack? Could the illiterate medieval peasant, with their highly trained memory, actually have had a greater command of certain types of knowledge than the average literate modern person? Number 13. What if your clothes could last a lifetime? We live in the age of fast fashion. We buy a shirt for the price of a coffee, wear it a few times, and throw it away when it goes out of style or a seam comes loose. The textile industry is a huge source of pollution and waste. In 2018, 11.3 million tons of textiles ended up in U.S. landfills. A medieval person would be horrified by this. For them, cloth was one of the most valuable things they owned. It was the product of immense labor, and think about what it took to make a simple linen shirt. You had to grow the flax, you had to harvest it, then go through a long process of retting, rotting the outer stalk, scutching, beating it to remove the woody parts, and heckling, combing the fibers to get the raw linen fibers. Then, those fibers had to be spun into thread, by hand, using a drop spindle or a spinning wheel. And then, that thread had to be woven into cloth on a loom. It was a slow, labor-intensive process, usually done by the women of the household during the winter months. A single garment represented weeks or even months of work. As a result, people owned very few clothes. A typical peasant might have one or two outfits, which they wore until they literally fell apart. Because textiles were so valuable, they were never just thrown away. Mending was not a hobby, it was an essential life skill. A hole in a tunic wasn't a reason to discard it. It was a reason to get out a needle and thread. They used darning techniques to reweave the fabric over a hole. They used patches, often on the inside to be less visible, to reinforce worn areas like elbows and knees. When a garment was truly beyond repair, it was not thrown out. It began a second life. It would be cut up. The best parts might be used to patch other clothes or be pieced together to make children's clothing or quilts. Smaller scraps would become cleaning rags. The most worn out, useless pieces would be sold to the rag and bone man, who would in turn sell them to a paper mill, as paper was made from linen and cotton rags until the 19th century. The final, decomposed scraps would end up in the compost heap. The life cycle of the textile was complete. Wills from the period, even from relatively poor people, often list specific items of clothing, showing just how valuable they were. The book The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer paints a vivid picture of a world where the clothes on your back were a significant part of your total wealth. This is a powerful antidote to our throwaway culture. The simplest application is to learn to mend your own clothes. A simple sewing kit is cheap. Learning to sew on a button, patch a hole, or fix a seam is easy thanks to online videos. It saves you money, reduces waste, and gives you a sense of satisfaction and ownership over your belongings. It shifts your mindset. You start to see your clothes not as disposable items, but as things to be cared for and maintained. It also makes you a more conscious consumer. When you know the effort it takes to mend something, you start to look for quality when you buy new things. You start thinking about the fabric, the stitching, and whether it's built to last. This medieval practice of make, do, and mend is a radical act in a consumerist society. It simplifies your wardrobe and your life, freeing you from the endless cycle of buying and discarding. What were the most sophisticated mending techniques they used that have been lost to us? Did they have a concept of visible mending as a form of decoration, or was the goal always to make the repair as invisible as possible? How did the trade in second-hand clothing work, and could a single garment pass through dozens of owners over a century? Were there black markets for specific types of cloth or thread given their high value? Well, number 12, can you really get warm next to a hole in the roof? Press a button on a thermostat. A furnace or heat pump kicks in, and warm air silently fills our entire home to a precise, uniform temperature. It's an invisible, effortless comfort. The medieval experience of warmth was entirely different. It was focused, communal, and a constant chore. The center of the home, literally and figuratively, was the fire. In an early medieval peasant longhouse, and even in the great halls of lords, the fire was an open hearth in the middle of the main room. There was no chimney. The smoke simply rose and found its way out through a hole in the thatched roof or through gaps in the gables. This sounds incredibly smoky and unpleasant, and it probably was, but it had advantages. The rising smoke would smoke the rafters, preserving the wood from insects and rot. It could also be used to smoke and preserve meat hanging from the ceiling. The fire itself was the single source of heat, light, and cooking. The entire life of the household revolved around it. People would work, eat, and sleep near the hearth. The heat wasn't evenly distributed. It was a radiant heat. You were warm on the side, facing the fire, and cold on your back. To be truly warm, you had to be close. This created a natural, communal gathering spot. As architecture evolved, fireplaces with chimneys were built into the walls, first in the castles of the wealthy and slowly trickling down to more common homes. But the principle of a single heat source remained. You didn't heat the whole house. You heated the room you were in, and you didn't just rely on the fire. They used a whole system of passive heating and personal warmth. They hung heavy woolen tapestries on the cold stone walls of castles. This wasn't just for decoration, it was a crucial layer of insulation, trapping a layer of still air against the wall. They covered the floors with layers of rushes or straw, which provided insulation from the cold ground. Their furniture was designed for warmth. High-backed settles, long wooden benches would be placed near the fire, their high backs blocking drafts. The four-poster bed was essentially a small, self-contained room. With heavy curtains drawn around it, the body heat of the sleepers would be trapped inside, creating a warm microclimate for sleeping. And of course they wore layers of clothing made of wool, a fantastic natural insulator even when damp. This is a lesson in zonal heating and energy efficiency. We waste a tremendous amount of energy heating empty rooms in our homes. The medieval approach was to heat the person, not the space. We can do this today. We can turn down the central thermostat by a few degrees and put on a sweater. We can use a small, efficient space heater to warm just the room we're in, rather than running a massive furnace. We can use heavy curtains over our windows at night to reduce heat loss. We can use draft stoppers at the bottom of doors. It's a different way of thinking about comfort. Instead of demanding a uniform, t-shirt friendly temperature everywhere, it's about creating cozy, warm zones where you need them. It saves money, it reduces our environmental impact, and it can actually feel more pleasant. There is a deep, primal comfort in sitting near a warm fire or snuggling under a heavy blanket that a blast of hot air from a vent can never replicate. How much did the constant inhalation of wood smoke from the open hearth affect their respiratory health and life expectancy? Were there specific types of wood they knew to burn that produced less smoke or more heat? Did the design of furniture like the high-backed settle evolve specifically in response to drafty medieval halls? What other now forgotten passive heating techniques did they use to survive the cold, especially during the Little Ice Age, which began in the 14th century? Number 11. Does a garden need more than just plants? And we think of a garden as rows of individual plants. We buy seeds, we plant them in neat lines, we weed out everything else. It's a very orderly, human-centric view of agriculture. The medieval gardener, particularly within the walls of a monastery, had a more integrated, holistic approach. Their gardens were complex ecosystems designed for productivity, utility, and sometimes spiritual meaning. Monastic gardens were the centers of medical and scientific knowledge for much of the period. A typical monastery would have several distinct gardens. There would be a kitchen garden for vegetables and herbs for cooking, an infirmary garden full of medicinal plants, an orchard for fruit, and often a cemetery garden planted with flowers and trees that had symbolic meaning. These gardens weren't just for growing things, they were living laboratories and libraries. Monks like the 12th century abbess, Hildegard of Bingen, wrote extensively about the properties of plants. In her work Physica, she described hundreds of plants and their uses in medicine. This knowledge was hard-won, the result of centuries of observation and trial and error. One of the key concepts they understood, even if they didn't have the scientific vocabulary for it, was the idea of a balanced system. They practiced crop rotation. They knew that planting the same crop in the same spot year after year would deplete the soil. The three-field system, which became widespread in the High Middle Ages, is a large-scale example of this. A village would have 3 large fields. In one year, one would be planted with wheat or rye, one with peas, beans, or lentils, legumes that fix nitrogen in the soil, and the third would be left fallow to rest and recover. This system dramatically increased food production and soil fertility. In their smaller gardens, they practiced a form of companion planting. They knew that certain plants grew well together. They might not have known that marigolds repel nematodes or that beans provide nitrogen for corn, but they observed the results. They also integrated animals. Geese could be used for weeding, and the manure from the monastery's pigs or chickens was a vital source of fertilizer. This is the foundation of modern organic gardening and permaculture. It's about creating a garden that functions like a natural ecosystem with all the parts supporting each other. We can do this in our own backyards. We can stop planting monocultures and start mixing our plants. Plant flowers among your vegetables to attract pollinators and beneficial insects. Or plant nitrogen fixing legumes like beans and peas to enrich your soil. Use compost to feed the soil, not chemical fertilizers. Let a part of your yard go a little wild to provide a habitat for wildlife. This medieval approach is less about controlling nature and more about partnering with it. It requires more observation and knowledge than just following the instructions on a seed packet, but it creates a more resilient, productive, and beautiful garden. It simplifies things because you end up fighting less against pests and diseases, and you don't need to buy a whole shed full of chemical sprays and fertilizers. You're creating a self-sustaining system, just like the monks did 1,000 years ago. How much knowledge of companion planting and soil science passed down through generations of gardeners was lost with the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century? Like, did they have specific non-chemical methods for dealing with major pests and blights that we have forgotten? Were the symbolic or spiritual reasons for planting certain things in certain places just superstition, or did they have a hidden ecological logic? Could the unique soil composition and microbial life of a medieval monastery garden have produced plants with medicinal compounds that are measurably different from those grown today? Number 10. What if you paid your debts with a stick? Our financial world is abstract. Numbers in a bank account, credit scores, transactions that are just blips of data. It can feel unreal and disconnected from our physical lives. In the medieval period, for many ordinary people, financial agreements were recorded in a brilliantly simple and physical way, the tally stick. A tally stick was a piece of wood, usually hazel or willow, that served as a contract and a receipt. Let's say a farmer owed a tax payment to his lord. He would go to the lord's reeve, his administrator. They would take a stick and write the details of the debt on it, maybe in Latin or with simple symbols. Then they would cut notches into the stick to represent the amount of money. A thick notch for a pound, a thinner one for a shilling, a scratch for a penny. The crucial part came next. They would split the stick in half lengthwise right through the middle of the notches. The reeve would keep one half, called the stock. This is where we get the term stockholder. The farmer would keep the other half, called the foil. The two pieces were a perfect, unique match. The pattern of the wood grain and the way the notches split were impossible to forge. When the farmer came to pay his debt, he would present his foil. The reeve would match it to the stock. If they lined up perfectly, it proved the debt was genuine. Once the debt was paid, the sticks could be destroyed or a new set made for the next transaction. This system was used for centuries. It was a brilliant solution in a society where most people were illiterate. You didn't need to read to understand the notches on a stick. It was a physical, tangible record that both parties could trust. The English Exchequer, the treasury of the British government, used tally sticks to record tax payments and government spending for over 700 years. They only officially abolished the system in 1826. In a famous and ironic historical event in 1834, they decided to dispose of the vast collection of old tally sticks by burning them in the furnaces beneath the Houses of Parliament. The fire got out of control and burned the entire building to the ground. The tally stick is more than a historical curiosity. It represents the principle of a clear, physical, and mutually understandable agreement. Our modern world of fine print, complex contracts, and digital currencies can be confusing and alienating. The tally stick was the opposite. It was simple, transparent, and built on a foundation of tangible proof. How can we use this idea? It's about seeking clarity and simplicity in our own agreements. When you lend a friend money, don't leave it as a vague verbal promise. Write it down on a piece of paper, both sign it, and each keep a copy. It feels formal, but it prevents misunderstanding and protects the friendship. It's about making the abstract physical. Instead of just having a number in a savings app, try using a simple jar system for budgeting a physical container for groceries, rent, savings. Seeing the money physically can change your relationship with it. The tally stick is a reminder that the best systems are often the simplest, and that trust is built on things we can see and touch. Were there master tally stick carvers whose notches were so precise they were considered a form of high craft? How did they deal with complex, multi-part transactions using such a simple system? Could a skilled forger actually have found a way to alter a tally stick, and what were the punishments for doing so? Did the physical act of carving the notches and splitting the wood create a stronger psychological sense of commitment to the debt than simply signing a piece of paper? Number 9. Could you make your own ink from a bug's nest? We type on keyboards. If we need to write by hand, we grab a disposable plastic pen. Ink is a cheap, ubiquitous commodity, but in the medieval world, ink was a handmade, almost alchemical substance. It was difficult to make, but incredibly permanent. For over 1,000 years, the standard ink in Europe was iron gall ink. And it was made from some very strange ingredients. The main ingredient is oak galls. An oak gall is a small, hard, round ball that grows on oak trees. It's not part of the tree itself. It's formed when a gall wasp lays its eggs in the tree's tissue. The tree has an immune reaction, forming this hard, woody growth around the wasp larvae. These galls are full of tannic and gallic acid. To make the ink, you would collect these galls, crush them into a powder, and soak them in water. Rainwater was preferred for several days. This would create a brownish, acidic solution. The second ingredient was vitriol, which is iron sulfate. This was often harvested from the earth in places where iron-rich minerals were exposed to the air and rain. When you add the iron sulfate to the gall solution, a chemical reaction occurs. The iron salts react with the tannic acid to form iron gallitannate, a black, water-soluble complex. When you first write with this ink, it often looks pale and grayish. But as it's exposed to the air, it oxidizes and darkens to a deep, permanent, waterproof black. It literally bites into the parchment or paper, bonding with the fibers. This is why so many medieval manuscripts are still perfectly legible today. The ink has become part of the page itself. The final ingredient was a binder, usually gum arabic, which is a hardened sap from the acacia tree. This helped the ink flow more smoothly from the quill pen and kept the black pigment particles suspended. Scribes in monasteries would have their own closely guarded recipes, sometimes adding wine instead of water, or a bit of honey to change the consistency. The Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript from around 700 AD, was written using a form of iron gall ink. Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks were filled with it. Why would anyone want to do this today? It's about process, not product. It's about slowing down and creating something with your own hands from natural materials. You can still buy oak galls and iron sulfate online. You can go through the process of crushing, soaking, and mixing. It connects you to a deep history of writing and knowledge. It also changes your relationship with the act of writing. When you've spent hours making your own ink, you don't want to waste it on a trivial shopping list. You want to write something that matters. You dip a pen, maybe even a real quill, and you feel the scratch on the paper. Each letter is a deliberate act. It's the polar opposite of dashing off a quick email. It's a form of mindfulness. It forces you to think before you write. It's a small rebellion against the ephemeral, disposable nature of digital communication. It's about creating something permanent, both on the page and in your own experience. What were the regional variations in ink recipes based on the specific chemistry of local plants and minerals? Did scribes have secret additives to prevent the ink from fading or to make it flow better in different weather conditions? How did they manage the corrosive nature of the ink, which could sometimes eat right through the parchment over centuries? Could the specific chemical signature of the ink in a manuscript be used to trace it back to a specific monastery or even a specific scribe? Number 8. Is boredom a problem to be solved? We have a device in our pocket that offers an infinite stream of entertainment. The moment we feel a pang of boredom, we can pull it out and scroll, watch, or play. We have come to see boredom as a negative state, an emptiness that needs to be filled immediately. A medieval peasant's life was full of hard work, but it also contained vast stretches of what we would call boredom. Long winter evenings with only a dim fire for light. Hours spent doing repetitive tasks like spinning wool or watching sheep. There was no on-demand entertainment, and this boredom might have been one of their secret strengths. Their entertainment was largely self-created, social, and seasonal. On a winter's night, families would gather around the fire. They wouldn't binge watch a show, they would tell stories, they would sing songs, they would mend tools or clothing, their hands busy while their minds and voices were engaged. It was a time for social bonding and the transmission of culture. They played games, board games like Nefatafall, a Viking strategy game, Nine Men's Morris, a game you can scratch into a piece of wood or the ground, and chess were popular. They played dice games. These weren't just for fun. They taught strategy, logic, and social skills. Entertainment was participatory, not passive. Festivals were the other great source of entertainment. The medieval calendar was punctuated by a series of religious holidays and feasts. These were times when the entire community would stop work and come together to celebrate. There would be music, dancing, feasting, and special events like mystery plays, dramatizations of Bible stories, or tournaments. These festivals provided a rhythm to the year, a cycle of work and celebration, fasting, and feasting. The book, The Stripping of the Altars, by Eamon Duffy, details the rich, vibrant, liturgical, and festive calendar that structured life in pre-Reformation England. This communal joy was a stark contrast to the daily grind. The key difference is that their downtime was not empty. It was either filled with low-level, useful activity mending, spinning that allowed the mind to wander, or with social interaction. This state of boredom, of not being actively entertained by an external source, is incredibly valuable for our brains. A 2014 study in the journal Creativity Research journal found that performing a boring task first actually led to people being more creative in a subsequent idea generation task. When our brains are not being bombarded with stimulation, they go into a default mode network. This is when we make connections, solve problems in the background, and have our most creative ideas. We've eliminated this fertile ground of boredom from our lives, and we may be less creative and more anxious as a result. We can reclaim this. The hack is simple: do nothing. Schedule time to be bored. Go for a walk without your phone or headphones. Sit in a chair and just stare out the window. Wash the dishes by hand without listening to a podcast. At first it will feel uncomfortable, even agitating. Your brain will crave the usual stimulation, but if you push through, you'll find that your mind starts to work in a different way. You'll notice things you hadn't noticed before. You'll have ideas that seem to come from nowhere. You'll be giving your mind the space it needs to breathe. It's about understanding that a state of low stimulation is not a problem to be fixed. It's a necessary condition for a healthy creative mind. Did the long, dark winters and lack of stimulation lead to widespread seasonal affective disorder, or did their social and cultural structures provide an effective antidote? How much of their storytelling and musical tradition was a direct creative response to the need to fill empty time? Were their minds, uncluttered by constant information, capable of a depth of focus and contemplation that is now impossible for us? Did the very concept of boredom as a negative state even exist for them, or is that a modern invention? Number 7. Could a guild save your career? We think of our careers as a solo journey. We build a personal brand. We network. We compete for promotions. It can be a lonely and precarious existence. In the medieval city, a craftsman's life was the opposite. It was deeply embedded in a community of peers, the guild. A guild was an association of all the artisans or merchants in a particular trade. The weavers had a guild, the blacksmiths had a guild, the bakers had a guild. These organizations controlled almost every aspect of their members' working lives. To practice a trade in a city, you had to be a member of the guild. The guild set the standards for quality. They would inspect goods to make sure a baker wasn't selling underweight bread or a weaver wasn't using shoddy thread. This protected the reputation of the trade and ensured a fair product for the consumer. The guild also controlled prices, preventing ruinous price wars between members. They limited the number of masters in the city, ensuring that there was enough work to go around for everyone. The guild provided a clear, structured career path. You started as an apprentice, usually as a young boy. You would live with a master craftsman, learning the trade in exchange for your labor. After many years, you would become a journeyman, a skilled worker who could travel and work for other masters for a daily wage. To become a master yourself, you had to produce a masterpiece to prove your skill to the guild, and you often needed enough capital to set up your own workshop. The guild was also a social safety net. They took care of sick members, they supported the widows and orphans of members who had died. They organized feasts and religious processions. It was a brotherhood, a combination of a trade union, a regulatory body, and a social club. The detailed records of guilds, such as those from the city of Florence, show how these organizations were the bedrock of the urban economy and society for centuries. This system is a far cry from the modern gig economy, with its lack of security, benefits, and community. While the guilds could be restrictive and monopolistic, they were founded on principles we've largely lost: community over competition, long-term stability over short-term profit, and a shared responsibility for maintaining standards. How can we apply this? We can seek out and build our own guilds. This could mean joining a professional organization and getting actively involved. It could mean forming a mastermind group with a small number of peers in your field to share knowledge, offer support, and hold each other accountable. For freelancers, it could mean forming a cooperative to bid on larger projects and share resources like health insurance. It's about a mental shift from seeing your colleagues as rivals to seeing them as fellow craftsmen who share a common interest. It's about collaboration and mutual support. In a world of increasing automation and economic uncertainty, this medieval idea of a strong, supportive professional community might be more relevant than ever. How much did the guild system stifle innovation? By enforcing traditional methods and resisting new technologies. Was the social safety net provided by the guild a genuine form of charity or a tool to maintain control over its members? Did secret knowledge or techniques, passed down only from master to apprentice, give certain guilds a competitive advantage that is now lost to history? What was the dark side of the guilds? How did they use their power to exclude women, foreigners, or other marginalized groups from the trades? Number 6. What if the sun told you the time? We live by the clock. Our days are chopped into minutes and seconds. We have meetings at 10:30, lunch at 12:15, deadlines at 5 sharp. We are slaves to a precise mechanical time that has no connection to the natural world. For the medieval person, time was a much more fluid and natural concept. It was measured by the sun, the seasons, and the rhythms of the body. The primary timekeeper was the sun. The day was divided into uniqual hours. They took the period of daylight from sunrise to sunset and divided it into 12 hours. This meant that an hour in the summer was much longer than an hour in the winter. This seems strange to us, but it was perfectly logical for an agricultural society. In the long summer days, there was more daylight, so the working hours were longer. In the short, dark days of winter, the working hours were shorter. Time was tied to the available light and the task at hand. You worked from dawn until dusk. Noon was simply when the sun was at its highest point in the sky. People people could tell the time with surprising accuracy just by looking at the position of the sun or the length of their own shadow. The church also played a huge role in marking time. The canonical hours, announced by the ringing of monastery or church bells, were the only fixed points in the day for many people. These bells would ring out across the fields, signaling the times for prayer, but also serving as a general clock for the entire community. It was an audible, communal sense of time, not a private, personal one. Mechanical clocks did exist in the later Middle Ages, starting in the 14th century, but they were huge, complex, and rare, found only in public clock towers. The idea of a personal timekeeping device was unthinkable. Our rigid 24-hour clock is a product of the Industrial Revolution, a necessity for coordinating factories and railways. It has disconnected us from the natural cycles of light and dark. This has a real biological cost. Our bodies have a natural circadian rhythm, an internal clock that is regulated by light exposure. When we ignore these rhythms by staring at bright screens late at night or working under artificial lights, we disrupt our sleep, our hormones, and our overall health. The historian Roger Eckwall has put forward the theory that before the industrial age, people practiced segmented sleep. They would sleep for a few hours after dusk, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night to think, pray, or be intimate, and then go back to sleep until morning. This period of quiet wakefulness was a normal part of the night, a casualty of our modern quest for 8 solid hours. The medieval hack is to pay more attention to the sun and less to the clock. Try to get outside and expose yourself to natural sunlight in the morning. This helps to set your internal clock for the day. In the evening, as the sun goes down, dim the lights in your home. Let your body's rhythm guide you more. Eat when you're hungry, sleep when you're tired. This doesn't mean ignoring all schedules, but it means recognizing that time is not just a number on a screen, it's a natural, flowing rhythm. It's about aligning our lives more closely with the ancient clock in the sky, the one our bodies have been following for millennia. How precisely could an experienced farmer or sailor tell the time of day just by looking at the sun? Were there other natural timekeepers, the behavior of animals, the opening and closing of certain flowers that they used? Did the shift from the fluid, unequal hours of the sun to the rigid, equal hours of the clock cause a kind of societal anxiety or psychological stress that is documented in the historical record? What did people do during that period of segmented sleep in the middle of the night? And what creative or spiritual insights have we lost by eliminating it from our lives? Number 5, are you eating your weeds? We go to the supermarket and buy vegetables that have been grown hundreds of miles away, bred for uniformity and shelf life, not for flavor or nutrition. In our own backyards, we diligently pull up dandelions, nettles, and plantain, throwing these weeds into the compost. A medieval peasant would find this baffling. For them, the line between a cultivated vegetable and a wild plant was much blurrier. Foraging for wild edibles wasn't a hobby. It was a crucial part of their diet. The medieval diet, especially for the poor, was often monotonous, based on bread, pottage, a thick stew of grains and vegetables, and whatever else was available. Wild plants, or weeds, were a free, accessible, and highly nutritious supplement to this. They provided essential vitamins and minerals that might otherwise be lacking, especially in the hungry gap of early spring before the first garden crops were ready. Stinging nettles, for example, are a powerhouse of nutrition rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. Once cooked, they lose their sting and can be used like spinach in soups and stews. Dandelions were another staple. The young leaves were eaten as a salad green. The name comes from the French dent de lion, or lion's tooth, referring to the shape of the leaves. The root could be roasted and ground as a coffee substitute. The flowers could be used to make wine. Many of the plants we now fight to eradicate from our lawns were once valued. Plantain, that low-growing plant with the broad leaves, was known as a healing herb, used in poultices for cuts and insect bites, but its young leaves are also edible. Chickweed, purslane, lamb's quarters, these were all part of the medieval forager's harvest. This knowledge was common, passed down from mother to daughter. They knew which plants to pick, where to find them, and which ones were poisonous. It was an intimate, practical knowledge of the local ecosystem. The famous Leech Book of Bald, an old English medical text from the 9th or 10th century, is filled with remedies that use these common, wild plants, showing how integrated they were into their understanding of both food and medicine. This is a skill we can easily revive. It starts with learning to identify a few common, safe, edible weeds in your own area. Get a good field guide. Start with one or two that are unmistakable, like dandelions or nettles. Wear gloves when harvesting. Try adding a few young dandelion leaves to your next salad. Try making a pot of nettle soup. You'll be surprised at the flavor. This practice does several things. It gives you free, organic, and incredibly nutritious food. And a 2014 study showed that dandelions have higher levels of some nutrients than spinach and kale. It reconnects you to the seasons and the natural world around you. You start to see your backyard or local park not just as a green space, but as a potential pantry. It's a simple act of defiance against a food system that has divorced us from the source of our sustenance. It's a reminder that nature is abundant if we only know how to look. How many edible or medicinal plants with significant benefits were common knowledge in the medieval period, but are now completely forgotten? Were there regional famine foods unpalatable, but life-saving, wild plants that people only ate in times of desperation? How did they teach their children to distinguish between edible and poisonous look-alike plants? And how often did deadly mistakes happen? Could the regular consumption of these wild bitter greens have provided their bodies with phytochemicals that protected them from certain chronic diseases that are common today? Number 4. How strong is a thread you twist yourself? We buy rope at the hardware store. It's made of nylon or polypropylene, spun by a machine in a factory. It's strong and reliable, but it has no story. It's a dead object. For a medieval person, rope and cordage were life or death technologies, and they were made by hand from the plants and animals around them. The process of making a simple piece of string was a fundamental human skill. The most basic form of this is creating cordage from plant fibers. You could use the inner bark of trees like lime basswood or elm. You could use the fibrous stalks of plants like nettles or milkweed. The process is called reverse wrapping. You take a bundle of fibers and hold it in the middle. You start twisting one half away from you. Then you bring that twisted half over the other half. Now you take the new bottom half and twist it away from you and bring it over the top. You keep repeating this motion, twisting one way and wrapping the other. As you get to the end of your fibers, you splice in a new bundle, overlapping them so the string maintains its strength. You know, it's a simple rhythmic motion that you can do while walking or sitting by the fire. With practice, you can create a surprisingly strong and uniform piece of twine or rope. This skill was essential. This homemade cordage was used for everything: to tie bundles of firewood, to make fishing nets, to string a bow, to tie down a roof, to mend a tool. Different materials were used for different purposes. Linen and hemp were cultivated specifically for their strong fibers, used to make the best ropes for ships and heavy-duty uses. And animal products were also used. Rawhide, untanned animal skin could be cut into strips to make incredibly strong lashings. Sinew, the tough tendon from the back of an animal like a deer, could be processed and twisted to make the strongest possible bowstrings and sewing thread. Their wool was spun into yarn for knitting and weaving. The Vikings were masters of this, and archaeological finds from places like the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dating to around 834 AD, include a vast array of textiles, ropes, and threads, showcasing their incredible skill. Why would we learn to do this? There's a practical survival aspect. Knowing how to make a strong piece of string from natural materials is a valuable skill if you're ever in an emergency situation. But the deeper value is in the process itself. It's a meditative, ancient skill that connects you directly to the natural world. Go outside and find some nettle stalks again with gloves, or the dead stalks of milkweed from last year. Peel off the outer layer and find the soft, fibrous inner layer. Start twisting. As you work the fibers with your hands, you are participating in a technology that is tens of thousands of years old. You are creating something strong and useful from something that most people would consider trash. It simplifies your thinking. It makes you realize that the world is full of resources, not just things to be bought. It's a small act that builds self-reliance and a deeper appreciation for the simple, foundational technologies that our civilization is built on. What specific plants in different ecosystems were the preferred source of fiber for cordage, and why? Did they have techniques for treating the fibers out with ash or by soaking them in certain liquids to make them stronger or more durable? How did the feel of the fibers in a master rope maker's hands tell them exactly how much to twist for maximum strength? Was the rhythmic, repetitive motion of making cordage used as a form of meditation or as a backdrop for storytelling? Number 3, could you survive on one pot? Our kitchens are full of gadgets, blenders, food processors, air fryers, microwaves, a dozen different pots and pans. Cooking can become a complex, multi-stage process involving a lot of equipment and a lot of cleanup. The medieval kitchen, especially for a peasant, was the essence of simplicity. For many, daily cooking was done in a single pot, suspended over the central hearth. This was the cauldron. It was a large, valuable, and versatile piece of equipment, often made of iron or bronze. It was the center of the family's nutrition. The main dish cooked in this pot was pottage. The word sounds unappetizing to us, but it was the staple food for a huge portion of the population for centuries. It wasn't one specific recipe. It was a constantly evolving, thick stew or porridge. The base was usually grains, oats, barley, or rye. To this, you would add whatever vegetables were available from the garden or foraged from the fields: peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, root vegetables. If the family was lucky, a bit of bacon or some other meat might be added for flavor. The pottage pot was never ending. It would be kept simmering over the fire for much of the day. The family would eat from it for their main meal. Then more water and more ingredients would be added to the leftovers to be eaten the next day. This perpetual stew could be kept going for days, the flavors deepening and changing over time. This method of cooking was incredibly energy efficient. You only needed one fire. It was also a way of using every scrap of food. Tough cuts of meat would become tender after hours of slow simmering. Their vegetable peels and ends would add flavor and nutrients. It was a simple, frugal, and nourishing way to eat. The archaeological evidence from medieval sites often uncovers fragments of these cooking pots, stained and blackened from constant use, a testament to their central role in daily life. This one pot cooking philosophy is a powerful way to simplify our lives. It saves time on both cooking and cleanup. It's a great way to use up leftover vegetables before they go bad, reducing food waste. It encourages you to eat more whole grains and vegetables. You don't need a cauldron. A slow cooker, a Dutch oven, or just a large stock pot can serve the same purpose. The idea is to embrace the simple, slow-cooked meal. A stew, a soup, a chili, a curry. A meal where all the ingredients meld together, where the flavors have time to develop. It's a more relaxed and forgiving way to cook. There's no complex timing of multiple dishes. You just put everything in the pot and let it simmer. It's a return to a more basic and comforting way of eating. It frees you from the stress of complicated recipes and fills your home with the warm, inviting smell of a slowly simmering meal. What were the regional variations of pottage based on local agriculture and foraging? Did they have a science of perpetual stew, knowing exactly which ingredients to add at which time to prevent it from spoiling or tasting bad? But were there heirloom pottage pots passed down through generations that were believed to give a special flavor to the food? Could the long, slow cooking process have unlocked certain nutrients or broken down anti-nutrients in the grains and vegetables in a way that modern, faster cooking methods do not? Number 2 is a knife, the only tool you really need. Look at a modern toolbox: drills, saws, sanders, dozens of specialized wrenches, and screwdrivers. We have a specific tool for every possible task. Now look at the belt of a medieval peasant or woodsman. Chances are you'd see one primary tool hanging there: a knife. Not a fancy specialized knife, but a simple, robust, all-purpose utility knife. In many cultures, this was known as a seax, a name that gave the Saxons their identity. This single tool was a marvel of versatility. It was their kitchen knife, used for slicing bread, cheese, and meat. It was their eating utensil, used to spear food from a common dish and bring it to their mouth forks were not in common use. It was their woodworking tool, used for carving a spoon, notching a piece of wood for a building project, or trimming a feather into a quill for writing. It was their agricultural tool, used for harvesting vegetables, cutting twine, or even for light pruning. For a hunter, it was used for skinning and butchering game. In a pinch, it was a weapon of self-defense. This one piece of sharpened steel was the key to their daily survival and productivity. They knew how to use it, and they knew how to maintain it. Keeping a keen edge on the blade was a constant, necessary task. They would use a whetstone, a piece of abrasive stone, to sharpen the blade. The ability to properly sharpen a knife was a fundamental skill, as important as knowing how to start a fire. A dull knife is inefficient and dangerous. This intimate relationship with a single, essential tool is something we've lost. We use our tools, but we don't often understand them. When they break, we replace them. When they get dull, we throw them away or buy a new one. The idea of owning one tool for a lifetime, of maintaining it, sharpening it, and knowing its every capability and limitation is alien to us. The Staffordshire Hoard, a massive collection of Anglo-Saxon treasure found in 2009, contains many beautifully crafted sword and seeks fittings, showing the immense cultural and practical value placed on a simple blade. The modern application is not to throw away all our tools and rely on a single knife. It's about adopting the mindset of a master of one tool. Choose one simple, high-quality tool and learn to use it exceptionally well. Maybe it's a good chef's knife in the kitchen. Learn how to chop, dice, and slice with precision. Learn how to sharpen it properly on a stone. This one skill will transform your cooking more than any gadget. Maybe it's a simple set of hand tools for woodworking. Learn to use a hand plane, a chisel, and a saw. The quiet, tactile experience of shaping wood by hand is profoundly different from using loud, aggressive power tools. It's about choosing depth over breadth. Instead of a dozen mediocre skills, develop a deep competence with one or two essential things. This simplifies your life because it builds genuine confidence and capability. You stop relying on a new gadget to solve every problem and start relying on your own skill. It's a shift from being a consumer of tools to a true craftsman. How did the design of the everyday seeks or utility knife vary by region and by the owner's profession? What were the lost techniques for sharpening a blade to a razor's edge using only natural stones? Did the owner of a knife develop such a feel for it that they could perform tasks by touch that seem impossible to us today? Was a person's knife seen as an extension of their identity, and what did it mean to lose it or have it stolen? Or number one, what if nothing was ever truly finished? We love things that are new, shiny, and perfect. A new car, a new phone, a house with flawless, unblemished walls. We see signs of wear and tear, a scratch, a patch, a faded spot, as imperfections, as signs of decay. Our goal is to preserve a state of perfect newness for as long as possible, and when we can't, we often replace the item. The medieval world had a completely different aesthetic and a different relationship with the objects they lived with. Nothing was ever truly finished because everything was in a constant state of being used, repaired, and adapted. Think of a medieval cathedral. These magnificent buildings were often under construction for centuries. A generation would build the nave, the next would add the transepts, another would build the tower. The styles would change over time. You can often see the transition from the rounded arches of the Romanesque to the pointed arches of the Gothic in a single building. It was never finished. In a modern sense, it was a living document, a project that evolved over hundreds of years. The builders of Chartres Cathedral, which was built mostly between 1194 and 1220, were working on a site that had been a place of worship for centuries before them, and the building continued to be altered and added to for centuries after. This mindset extended to everyday objects. A wooden bowl would be used until it cracked, then it would be repaired with a metal staple or a butterfly key. A piece of clothing would be patched and repatched, the new fabric a visible record of its long life. A tool with a broken handle would be given a new one. A house would be constantly maintained, the thatch replaced, the daub patched, a new room added for a growing family. There was no concept of a finished product that was meant to be preserved in a static state. That objects were partners in the process of living. Their scars, their repairs, their signs of wear were not blemishes. They were the story of the object's life, a testament to its usefulness and durability. This is similar to the Japanese aesthetic concept of wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection and impermanence. This is perhaps the most profound and simplest hack of all. It's about learning to love the imperfect. It's about letting go of the stress of trying to keep everything new and perfect. It's okay if your wooden table has a few scratches from family dinners. Those are memories. It's okay if your favorite sweater has a visible patch. That's a sign of care. It's about shifting your goal from preservation to maintenance. Instead of worrying about protecting your possessions, focus on caring for them. Oil the wooden cutting board, sharpen the garden shears, sew the button back on the shirt. This mindset reduces anxiety and consumption. You stop seeing your possessions as disposable and start seeing them as companions on your life's journey. You become a steward, not just an owner. This acceptance of the ongoing, imperfect nature of things is a deep source of peace. It frees you from the impossible standard of newness and allows you to find beauty in the real, the used, and the well-loved. Do they have a word or a concept that captured this idea of a beautiful, well-repaired object, similar to wabi-sabi? At what point was an object considered beyond repair and ready for the scrap heap, and was this a moment of sadness or just practicality? Could a skilled repairman, a tinker, a cobbler, a seamstress actually increase the value or beauty of an object through their repair? Did this constant process of maintenance and repair create a deeper psychological bond between people and their few material possessions than we can ever have with our countless disposable goods?